The Indian government just tried to totally rewire the country's electoral map, but failed to get that crucial two-thirds majority, making it the very first government bill to crash on the lower house floor in 15 years.
First, there's the Constitution 131st Amendment Bill 2026. It expands the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, from a maximum of 550 members to a staggering 850 members.
That is a massive jump.
Right. That's 815 seats from the states and 35 from union territories.
And alongside that, you have the Delimitation Bill 2026, which is crucial because it actually creates the legal and bureaucratic machinery to redraw the constituency boundary. And finally, you've got the Union Territories Laws Amendment Bill 2026. That one simply operationalizes these exact changes for regions like Delhi, Jammu and Kashmir, and Puducherry.
The government's ambitious push to expand the Lok Sabha to 850 seats, utilizing 2011 census data to finally implement the 33% women's reservation quota. But peeling back the layers of the Delimitation Bill 2026 revealed a fierce existential clash between demographic reality and federal equity. We are witnessing a high-stakes debate over whether the core democratic principle of one person, one vote, should override the economic and developmental successes of the southern states. So currently, the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of India's parliament, has a maximum capacity of 543 seats.
Okay.
These new bills propose increasing that maximum capacity to an unprecedented 850 seats. And out of those 850, the legislation caps the number of members chosen from the states at 815,
Okay.
with up to 35 members coming from the union territories.
So that is just an enormous influx of new politicians into the system.
Oh, yeah.
And to actually figure out where those politicians come from, the Delimitation Bill empowers the central government to set up what's called a Delimitation Commission.
Their job is to physically redraw the geographic boundaries of every single constituency across the country.
They take census data, they break the country down into these tiny population blocks and try to draw boundaries so that every MP represents roughly the same number of people.
Right, while also accounting for administrative borders and geographic features like rivers or mountains, community continuity.
It is a massive, complex geographical puzzle.
Commission is headed by a Supreme Court judge, along with the chief election commissioner and state election commissioner.
Right.
They also have 10 associate members from each state, 5 federal MPs, and 5 state-level MLAs. But the kicker here is that these associate members from the states have absolutely no voting rights on the commission's decisions.
These associate members are the elected representatives of the people in those states.
They know the ground reality.
Exactly. They can assist, they can provide local geographic context, they can advise on community boundaries, but when it comes down to actually voting on where the final lines are drawn, they're essentially glorified observers.
It is. And the most critical detail here is their authority.
Right.
Once this Delimitation Commission publishes its final orders in the Gazette of India, which is essentially the government's official journal for legally binding notices, those orders have the absolute force of law. The legislation explicitly states these newly drawn maps cannot be called into question in any court.
Wow, so no judicial review at all.
None. It is a definitive final reshaping of the electoral map.
And to understand why it was built this way, you have to look at the history of redistricting globally.
Okay.
Historically, making delimitation orders legally bulletproof was designed to prevent politicians from tying up the redistricting process in courts for decades with endless bad faith litigation. It was meant to ensure the map actually gets drawn.
I get the logic, but the cost of that efficiency is a complete lack of a safety net. If a state feels they've been blatantly gerrymandered or communities of interest have been maliciously split apart, they have nowhere to go. No appeals process.
Precisely. This raises an important question. When you have a process that is essentially unchallengeable in a court of law, transparency and public trust become the only currency you have to legitimize the outcome.
And is that trust there?
Well, past delimitation exercises, such as the highly controversial recent ones in Jammu and Kashmir, faced heavy criticism for exactly this reason. Geopolitical thinkers looking at this bill warned that India is already characterized by extreme fiscal and legal centralization.
Right.
State interests are highly vulnerable to national partisan politics.
So if the new map heavily skews toward the north, the math of winning an election completely changes.
It changes the entire strategy of national governance. If the demographic shift allows a single political party to achieve a comfortable, bulletproof national majority simply by sweeping a few densely populated northern states, the electoral will of the South and the Northeast could be rendered effectively irrelevant.
Wow.
It fuels feelings of profound political marginalization and severely strains the fabric of cooperative federalism. Under the current framework, specifically Article 82 of the Constitution, the process of readjusting parliamentary constituencies is frozen, completely locked down until the first census conducted after the year 2026.
Exactly. And the proposed 131st Amendment tackles this by seeking to just delete that post-2026 requirement entirely.
Just wipe it out.
Yeah, it delinks the whole delimitation process from that future timeline. Instead, it alters the definition of population to mean data from, and I'm quoting the bill here, such census as Parliament may by law determine.
Which gives the government the legal runway to use the 2011 census data. Why this sudden rush? I mean, the 2027 census process has already started.
Well, the government's stated rationale for this urgency really comes down to the speed of implementation.
Okay.
The argument they are presenting is that if they wait for the post-2026 census data to be fully collected, analyzed, and officially published, it could take years.
So it pushes everything back.
Right. It would push these electoral reforms indefinitely into the late 2020s or even the 2030s.
Got it.
They argue that demographic realities have already shifted so drastically since the last seat adjustment that operating on the current map is untenable.
I see.
So they want to expedite the overhaul now, using the most recent fully published census, which just happens to be from 2011.
Okay, but knowing that the House is expanding to 850 seats only answers half the puzzle.
Right.
The real question is, what suddenly lit the fuse on this legislation today? And the answer to that actually starts back in September 2023. With Nari Shakti Vandanadhiniyam, the Women's Reservation Act.
That 2023 law was a landmark piece of legislation. It mandates a 33% reservation for women in the Lok Sabha and all state assemblies.
Which is huge.
Oh, it was universally celebrated. But it came with a massive structural catch.
Right. The catch was that the law was strictly tied to a future delimitation exercise.
Exactly.
It couldn't just be rolled out the next day. So these new bills aim to fast-track that exact process. Under this new expanded House of 815 state seats, 272 of those seats will be specifically reserved for women.
And those 272 seats won't just be static, by the way.
What do you mean?
The legislation dictates that the reserved seats will be allotted by rotation among different constituencies across the states.
Oh, so practically that means if your constituency is reserved for a female candidate in one election cycle, it might be an open, unreserved seat in the next.
Yes, while the reservation shifts to a neighboring district.
That's interesting.
It ensures that the burden or the opportunity of reserved seats moves dynamically across the map over time. The opposition parties, however, are pointing to a very different set of mechanics behind the scenes.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Leaders like Priyanka Gandhi Vadra and Shashi Tharoor, they've made it very clear in their statements today that they fully support the implementation of the women's quota.
Right. No one is arguing against the 33%.
Exactly. Their opposition is entirely focused on the requirement to link that quota to the delimitation process.
Yeah, I was reading through the law blogs trying to understand why these two things were stitched together in the first place.
It's a great question.
Because if everyone in Parliament agrees that a 33% reservation for women is necessary, why couldn't they just pass a law today that reserves 33% of the existing 543 seats?
Yeah.
Why trigger a massive, complicated redraw of the national map? And the analysts use a very specific phrase to explain this: political demonetization.
It is a striking term.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because, as I understand it, political demonetization essentially means that if you implement a 33% quota within the existing fixed number of 543 seats.
Hundreds of sitting male politicians are going to get fired overnight.
Exactly. You would have to forcibly retire a massive chunk of male incumbents to make room for female candidates.
And that is the core political reality the analysts are highlighting. By expanding the total number of seats to 850, the math changes entirely.
Right.
You can bring in 272 women without necessarily displacing the existing male power structure.
But Priyanka Gandhi Vadra brought a sharp counter-argument to that exact point on the floor today.
She did.
She challenged the Prime Minister's claim that politicians aren't afraid of losing their positions. She argued that if leaders truly aren't afraid of stepping aside for the greater good, they should have absolutely no problem sacrificing their existing seats for women right now.
within the current framework of 543 seats.
Right.
Her argument really highlights a deep skepticism within the opposition about whether this massive parliamentary expansion is genuinely necessary for women's reservation.
Or if it's a Trojan horse.
Exactly. If the reservation is being used as a vehicle to achieve other demographic and political ends.
This expansion disrupts a fragile, carefully negotiated federal truce that has held India together since the 1970s.
To grasp the gravity of this, we really have to look back to 1976 and the 42nd Amendment.
Okay, take us back.
Up until that point, seats in the Lok Sabha were redistributed among states after every single census, purely based on population size.
Okay.
If your state gained more people, your state gained more seats in parliament.
Which, sounds completely logical on the surface. One person, one vote.
Right.
But in the 1970s, the Indian government launched an aggressive nationwide push for population control and family planning. And the states responded to those national guidelines very differently.
The divide was largely regional and socioeconomic.
No.
States in the south, like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, they invested heavily in public health, female literacy, and social welfare programs.
Right.
And as a direct result of those socioeconomic improvements, their fertility rates plummeted and their population growth slowed down significantly.
While populations in the north.
Exactly. Populations in many of the more agrarian northern states continued to grow rapidly.
So the southern states realized a massive problem was looming. If Parliament kept redistributing seats based solely on raw population numbers, the southern states would actively lose political power.
Right.
Precisely because they successfully followed the National Family Planning Guidelines. The South followed the rules, they lowered their population growth to help the nation's resource constraints, and their reward would be losing their voice in the national government.
And the political tension over this was immense.
I can imagine.
So, to prevent penalizing the states that curbed their population growth, the 1976 amendment instituted a freeze.
Okay.
It locked the interstate allocation of seats based on the 1971 census. The map was literally frozen in time.
Wow.
It was a vital compromise between the pure democratic ideal of absolute equal representation and the federal need to maintain fair state representation regardless of subsequent population booms.
And you can see the extreme mathematical strain of that 50-year freeze today.
Oh, it's highly visible.
Because populations kept growing unevenly. So a member of parliament from Kerala currently represents about 1.75 million people on average.
Right.
Meanwhile, an MP from a state like Bihar represents roughly 3.1 million people. The literal weight of a single vote is wildly different depending on where you happen to live.
It is. But lifting that freeze right now and basing a new seat distribution on the 2011 census data will cause a seismic shift in national power. Lifting the freeze would cause the Hindi heartland, which refers to those highly populous northern and central states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan, to see their share of Lok Sabha seats rise from 38.1% to 43.1%.
While the southern states' overall share of seats would fall from 24.3% down to 20.7%.
Exactly. And in the Indian system, political representation at the center is directly tied to fiscal power.
It's about money.
It's about money and resources. Losing proportionate representation in parliament, it directly impacts tax devolution, how national resources are allocated back to the states, and their overall federal influence.
The southern states, despite having a smaller population, contribute roughly 60% of India's tax revenue.
60%.
Yeah. They generally boast much higher gross domestic products. It is the classic fear of taxation without adequate representation.
Right.
If tax devolution formulas, which is how the central government distributes money back to the states, continue to heavily weight population, these states fear they'll be generating the lion's share of the nation's revenue, but will have a shrinking political voice in the central government that decides how that revenue is spent. The government is mounting a vigorous defense against the accusation that the South is going to suffer under this new map. Home Minister Amit Shah actually brought specific math to the floor to defend the bills.
He did, explicitly addressing the Southern concerns.
Right.
He stated that a false narrative is being intentionally spread by the opposition. He used the southern state of Karnataka as his prime example.
What was his argument there?
He pointed out that Karnataka currently has 28 seats, which equals about 5.15% of the total 543-member House.
Okay, 5.15%.
Under the new bill's expansion, Karnataka would be allocated 42 seats. In a larger House of 816 state members, those 42 seats still equal roughly 5.14% of the House.
So basically the exact same percentage.
Yes. Furthermore, Law Minister Arjunan Ram Meghwal explicitly promised the House that neither men nor any state will suffer a loss after the implementation of this quota and delimitation.
But the opposition is aggressively countering not just the math, but the underlying intent here.
Right.
Akhilesh Yadav, the leader of the Samajwadi Party, argued that the government is rushing this expansion using old 2011 data, specifically because they want to avoid mounting demands for a modernized caste-based census.
Yeah, that was a huge point of contention today.
He demanded on the floor that any census data used for delimitation must include caste enumeration, and he pushed for a subquota specifically for OBC women, other backward classes, to be carved out within the 33% reservation.
And Asaduddin Owaisi, the AMM chief, took an even harder line on the regional divide.
What did he say?
He explicitly called this a backdoor attempt to rule the South. He argued that removing the delimitation freeze inherently hands unchecked power to the larger northern populations, while simultaneously diluting the representation of regional minorities and OBCs.
The Home Minister claims Karnataka's percentage of power stays exactly the same at around 5.14%.
Right.
But all the demographic projections explicitly show the North's overall share of power rising and the South's overall share dropping.
Yes.
How can both of those things be true? Let's do the math on this together.
Let's look at the absolute numbers first. Home Minister Shah is technically correct in absolute terms. Under an expanded House, every single state will physically gain more members of parliament.
So no one is losing a seat.
Right. No state is losing a chair they already have.
Yeah.
Karnataka goes from 28 chairs to 42. Kerala goes from 20 to 23. Uttar Pradesh goes from 80 to 138. But Parliament doesn't operate on absolute numbers. It operates on proportional voting power. If Uttar Pradesh gains 58 brand new seats due to its massive population growth since 1971, and Kerala gains only 3 new seats.
Wow. 58 versus 3.
Yeah. Kerala's proportional voting power to block or pass legislation inevitably shrinks.
So even if Karnataka specifically maintains its rough 5% share, the collective southern bloc loses ground to the collective northern bloc.
Doesn't this also rewrite the math for how the President of India is chosen?
It does. It totally shifts the balance. The President of India is chosen by an electoral college made up of federal MPs and state-level legislators, known as MLAs.
Okay.
Currently, the value of their votes is pegged to the 1971 census to ensure parity across states. But if this delimitation exercise fundamentally alters the number of MLAs and MPs based on newer population data, it completely rewrites the arithmetic of the Electoral College. Suddenly, the states with the booming populations gain a disproportionate and potentially unilateral say in electing the head of state. Depending on what state you live in, the actual literal weight of your vote might shift significantly in the coming years based entirely on how these geographic boundaries are redrawn. Policy analysts and geopolitical experts have put forward several fascinating models to reconcile this tension. The most prominent is what they call the hybrid model.
How does that actually work in practice? Do you just, stop counting people?
No, you don't stop counting people, but you stop making population the singular overriding metric for political power.
Okay.
The hybrid model suggests that the Delimitation Commission should use a weighted formula for seat allocation. Yes, population counts, but you actively balance it by factoring in demographic performance. For example, you measure how well a state successfully lowered its total fertility rate over the last 40 years. You also factor in economic contribution, looking closely at their gross state domestic product or their national goods and services tax, the GST collections.
That makes sense.
And you factor in their human development index. By weighting these factors alongside population, you ensure that high-performing states maintain a robust political voice, preventing them from being penalized for their success.
That seems like a logical compromise, but it would be a radically different way of thinking about representation. What about the upper house? I know there is talk in the sources about fundamentally changing the Rajya Sabha.
This is one of the most sweeping constitutional proposals on the table right now. Currently, seats in India's Rajya Sabha are somewhat linked to population.
Right.
A massive state like Uttar Pradesh has significantly more upper house seats than a smaller state like Kerala. The proposal is to reform the Rajya Sabha to function exactly like the United States Senate.
Oh, where California, with nearly 40 million people, gets exactly 2 senators. And Wyoming, with 500,000 people, also gets exactly 2 senators.
Right, equal representation for every state, regardless of population size. If India adopted this model, the Rajya Sabha would act as a genuine federal safeguard.
I see.
Even if the southern states lose proportional power in the Lok Sabha, they would have an equal veto power in the upper house to block legislation that harms their regional interests.
Are there other, perhaps more administrative solutions?
There are. There are suggestions to radically strengthen the role of the Finance Commission, legally ring-fencing the tax share of southern and hill states so their financial health is completely decoupled from their political seat count.
Okay, protect the money.
Yeah. And there are even serious geopolitical proposals to bifurcate massive states like Uttar Pradesh.
Wait, splitting it into smaller states?
Yes. Breaking it into 3 or 4 smaller administrative units. The logic is that smaller states are often easier to govern efficiently. And crucially, it ensures that no single massive geographic bloc can completely dictate national politics through sheer size alone. But constitutional scholars stress that regardless of the final number of seats or the specific mathematical formula used, the ultimate metric of success for the Delimitation Commission is legitimacy.
You trust in the system.
The process must be viewed as inherently fair by all states. In a healthy federal democracy, even the states who ultimately lose proportional power must agree to abide by the results because they trust the machinery that drew the map.
Right.
If that trust is broken by a lack of transparency or perceived gerrymandering, the structural integrity of the entire federal union is at serious risk. If we scale the Lok Sabha up from 543 members to 850 members,
Yeah.
how does that physically and practically change the daily nature of Indian democracy? Does packing that many politicians into a single room actually lead to better, more diverse representation for the citizens? Or does it risk turning the highest lawmaking body in the land into an unmanageable crowd where individual voices are completely drowned out in the noise of the masses? I mean, it's easily one of the most consequential shifts in India's democratic structure since independence.